Dr. Anthony Bergin and Sarah Haley, thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure, Claire.
Thank you.
You're here to discuss your new ASPI paper, Security Through Aid, released today. Now, Anthony, why is it important for Australia to address terrorism and violent extremism through our development agenda?
Well, clearly international terrorism is a top security priority for this government, but I think one of the areas that we've neglected, Claire, over the years in our toolkit, if you like, for dealing with terrorism and violent extremism is our development assistance program. Currently, our foreign aid is around $4 billion, and what this paper is about is how we can better leverage development assistance into our international efforts to counter violent extremism. We're not arguing in the paper that Australia has never attempted this, but one of our principal findings is that we've really only taken baby steps over the years to try and leverage our aid programs into our international counter-terrorism efforts. So this paper is really about trying to think through the conceptual issues and some of the practical issues involved in trying to leverage development. And the reason why Sarah and I believe this paper is timely is because up until very recently, we've obviously had a separate aid agency, AusAid, with the Foreign Ministry having responsibility for coordinating our international counter-terrorism efforts, and obviously AusAid was focused on mainstream development activities. Since the amalgamation of AusAid into our Foreign Affairs Department, we believe that now provides an opportunity to think through how, in a practical sense, we can, as I say, leverage foreign aid into our international counter-terrorism efforts.
Sarah, it's generally accepted that poverty does not beget terrorism, but what impact does terrorism have on poverty and development?
So you're quite correct. There's no causal link between poverty and terrorism, but it is generally accepted that poor people are the most affected by terrorism. If you look at the massive human cost in developing nations compared to the Western world and the impact that terrorism has there, with massive fatalities over the last decades. There's also the impact to foreign direct investment and tourist revenues, which is often the highest point of income for many developing nations. So these developing nations compared to Western nations who are able to overcome any shifts in markets, any vulnerability that terrorist activities can cause, developing nations don't have those resources to sustain income and economic development through those times. So whilst terrorism isn't caused by poverty, there is a clear link between the impact that terrorism has on developing nations and poor nations. Anthony, do you have anything to add?
I think Sarah is absolutely right to emphasise the economic impacts of terrorism on developing countries, but I also think it's worth pointing out that I think most people now understand development as a broader concept than purely the economic dimension. So terrorism does directly impact on people's freedom to live life without fear of harm. It impacts on freedom of expression. It impacts on women's developmental pathways. So I think Sarah's absolutely right to emphasise the point that terrorism has overwhelmingly impacted on developing countries. But I think there's this broader concept of development too that we need to take into account when we're looking at the impacts of violent extremism on developing countries.
Dr. Bergin, in the paper you discuss two approaches for incorporating countering violent extremism, or CVE, into the development agenda. What are they?
We tried in this paper to think through conceptually how our aid program managers and our foreign affairs officials and our counter-terrorism agencies should think through development assistance and countering violent extremism. What we in the end have found or suggested was that where there is clear evidence that terrorism and violent extremism are absolutely impacting on a country's mainstream development pathways, then we should try and develop specific and dedicated CVE aid programs. However, where there's not clear evidence that terrorism is impacting on development, what Sarah and I have suggested is that we, if you like, put a CVE or countering terrorism filter over our existing programs for two reasons. One, to see whether our existing programs can be mutually supportive of countering violent extremism objectives, and two, to ensure that, as the doctors say, we do no harm, that in developing our aid programs we don't aggravate in any sense tendencies towards violent extremism in the recipient country. For the most part, our paper really argues that it will be the CVE filter approach that will probably get the most returns to Australia. However, we do say that there may be trade-offs required in those cases where terrorism can be shown to directly impact on a country's development. So, for example, if we're giving money to humanitarian and disaster response in one country, but that country is also being affected by terrorism, then it may well be that hard choices and trade-offs have to be made.
Sarah, the OECD official development assistance does not allow for counter-terrorism to be included in the aid budget. So how will this work with your recommendations?
So the OECD Development Assistance Committee, or DAC, have certain criteria on what can be classified or reported as official development assistance. Within that, it is stipulated that activities that counter terrorism cannot be reported as ODA. This was done with the understanding that those activities would be with the primary advantage of the donor country over the recipient country. However, the recommendations that Dr. Bergin and I are making in the paper are more to do with preventative measures to stop the impacts that violent extremism and terrorism can have on developing nations. It's creating a regional stability that will have long-term effects in combating terrorism and violent extremism. That said, these changes to there have been many changes to ODA criteria over the last decade or so, with a global shift towards more security-based development programs and agenda. This is very clear in movements from the US and the UK, through Canada and a fair few EU nations as well, who have been incorporating more security focuses through their ODA. In fact, quite a few years ago, about 2005 I believe, the OECD released a report themselves focusing on how counter-terrorism activities can be incorporated into official development assistance. A few months ago, the chair of ODA's Development Assistance Committee actually released an article in the Huffington Post describing the impact that development assistance can have on terrorism and countering violent extremism. So there's a clear shift in the global focus towards moving a security agenda and a security focus through development assistance.
Concur, of course, with Sarah on that, and I think the key recommendation flowing from those findings is that Australia should not be sitting pat waiting for change to happen. We should be arguing within the OECD framework that the guidelines ought to be modified to explicitly recognise that foreign aid spending on CVE be officially registered as part of a country's overseas development assistance program. So Australia has been, as Sarah indicated, extremely conservative when it comes to how we measure, what we count as our foreign aid when it comes to supporting counter-terrorism activities, even to the point where preventive activities like assisting on travel security and port security we haven't counted as aid. So this paper is recommending that Australia take this issue head on and try and get other countries on board so that there's no question that we can count our expenditure in this area as part of our official development assistance program.
Dr. Bergin, are you suggesting that we either increase our aid budget to accommodate this, or that we change our geographic focus to where terrorism is occurring?
I think the answer, Claire, to both questions is no. This paper is not necessarily positing that we need to increase our aid budget. As you'd be aware, our aid budget's now around $4 billion, and it has taken some significant hits over the last 18 months. But our focus in this paper is in trying to come up with a conceptual framework rather than focusing on the actual quantum of aid. And apropos your second question, are we in this paper arguing that the geographic priorities for our aid shift from our current Indo-Pacific focus? No, that would be too big a fallout, I think, from this paper to suggest that we widen the geographic coverage of our foreign aid. However, if you look at, for example, the Global Terrorism Index, many of the countries that feature high on the list of countries that are impacted adversely by terrorism are very squarely in the Indo-Pacific. So we're not, as I say, suggesting that in this paper that we stretch our aid into areas outside our current geographic focus of the Indo-Pacific neighbourhood.
And finally, Dr. Bergin, has there been any proven success in the past with development-based CVE programs?
It's a very good question, Claire, because one of the findings from this study is that the evidence base is quite thin here. We're tracing the sort of patterns of causation between a foreign aid project and reducing terrorism is very, very difficult. And of course, we're not arguing in this paper that investing aid in this area is immediately going to break up terrorist groups. So one of the recommendations that we make is that Australia try and undertake some pilot projects in this area. We've suggested, for example, in Kenya and Bangladesh, that we might undertake some dedicated CVE projects so that we can contribute to the stockpile of knowledge and lessons learnt in this area, not only with our traditional partners, but also there are many countries that in the aid area that are operating in areas where Australia isn't providing aid, so that we've got a good something to contribute to the overall lessons learnt of how we can leverage aid for countering violent extremism. The other recommendation that we make here that I think is relevant is that earlier this year the Foreign Minister established a new innovation hub within the Foreign Ministry to try and really generate new ideas, fresh ideas for our aid program. So one of our recommendations is that the so-called innovation exchange be used to try and canvass ideas, bright ideas, new ideas of how our aid budget can support our international efforts to counter violent extremism.
Great. Well, Dr. Anthony Bergin, Sarah Haitley, thank you for joining us today to discuss this very interesting new paper.
Thank you very much, Claire.
Thanks.